So welcome back. I think this is maybe episode 7. This will be talking about when the scale stalls, plateaus, adaptation, and exercise. And so again, the goal of this is really just to sort of mimic and to have available for review kind of what those first visits often are like. And so, the first one we were always dedicated to really explaining, probably, over explaining maybe a little bit, but I love that, the nerdy stuff. As far as obesity physiology, what underlies this, getting into what kind of motivates us to eat, truly understanding and getting back to mindful and intuitive eating. We surveillance weighing, and then kind of visit 2, we're going over, okay, we're going to add some extra work. We want to make sure we have adequate protein and tracking. And so then kind of when we come back, that 3rd month and going over visit 3, that's usually when probably, if it hasn't already, something's going wrong, and that's okay. That's a good thing. One reason, that I always think it's good if a weight loss journey takes a long time is that life will inevitably happen. Something's going to go wrong, right? Because it's life. And so it's better for us to encounter that, during your journey, together, and work through that, because this is going to continue to happen, right? For the rest of your life. And so there's so many things that kind of factor into that, right? And so, one of the first things we do, and I really try to do that from the very first visit, is say you're a human being. And so weight loss will plateau about every 5 to 10%. And that's just because as I like to think of it, we're always up against the caveman in our brainstem that thinks, all fat is good fat just for survival, right? So we're always going to hit these, and this is normal. This is not my fault, right? There's nothing wrong with me. And in the best way possible, nothing special about this. This was always expected. It's always going to happen. And so we really want to internalize that language with ourselves and make that, comforting and this is just normal, right? And so one of the first things I like to check in on, at that time is just, okay, still engaging in surveillance weighing, kind of go over that as really just this way to communicate with your own body. It's always going to tell us the truth. This is a positive relationship, right? It's not even really about the number. It's about the graph, right? It's going to tell us is what we are doing working, right? And then also, if there's been any kind of stumbling and things, and we always want to reemphasize sort of this pattern, right? This overall kind of treatment pattern, in that what we need to get along day to day is the surveillance weighing, that feedback, that timely feedback from our body, and is what we are doing working. But then, when inevitably that doesn't work, then we just seamlessly shift into maybe a few days of that's that more granular tracking. Right. And so, and then if we're still if we know we're doing everything right, those 4 variables of food that we talked about in terms of amount and, not too late. So the timing, the frequency, and then the quality, you're doing all that right. Okay. So it's not you, right? This is a plateau. And so, when that happens, we do take the time to say, hey, this is totally normal. And then we start looking for the why. Right. And so, these will always happen. We always have plateaus and setbacks. The biggest reason, physiologically at least, is once we get to that 10% loss. And a lot of times I will tell patients that number from the beginning. This is when I would expect that we're going to get stuck. And it's really shocking, even when taking a kind of weight history from someone, how much of the time they're always getting stuck at that 10%, because that is when metabolic adaptation sets in. Okay. And again, that is that greater than expected drop in metabolic rate. If you lose weight, right, if you're 100 pounds smaller, I would expect, right, you're a third smaller. So we have, a smaller or a lower metabolic rate. However, after 10% loss, that's when the body's like, wow, she's really trying to kill us now. And so it's going to just drop, right? There's going to be a significant adjustment in metabolic rate, much more than we would expect. So it's not proportional, right? Really interesting graphs and publications on this. And so it does persist. Some amount of adaptation does persist. And so we understand that we're going to stall there, right? And so, one big reason is, okay, maybe the calories are wrong because we're past that point for metabolic adaptation. The other thing that can happen is, life, right? And so, I always, share a lot in September of 24. The computer system and where I work was out, and that felt very traumatizing. Like it felt like, kind of echoes of COVID. And what was one of my biggest challenges while losing was, binge and emotional eating. Right. And so, yeah, we are who we are, and I'm not suddenly not me, just because I've lost weight. And so, yeah, I didn't step on a scale for 5 days and gained, 8 pounds in 5 days. And I engaged in that comforting behavior. Right. But, part of the art of this over time is to like acknowledge, right? Because so one way to look at this, so sometimes we'll revert to prior like behaviors, right? But let's talk about that for a moment, because you can choose to look at this as, oh my gosh, I did something terrible. I fell off and you shouldn't even be on a diet because we're modifying yours, right? But, I didn't do what I was supposed to do. And so you can just really get on to yourself and castigate yourself and be really down. Or you could choose to think, like, yeah, I'm a human being. It was a, really stressful, a time I engaged in actually fairly logical behavior, by consuming something that's going to like raise dopamine. And it's like, it actually like made me feel better. And so there's a logic to this, right? And so we can choose to be all about perfection and shame, 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 or you could be like, own it, right? Like, this is who I am. There's always going to be some part of me that knows deep in my heart, that bite of the crumbled cookie actually like really does make me feel better. And right or wrong, right? I mean, it does. And so, coming to terms with that, with yourself, and just having a little grace, the good news is I didn't like stay in that, oh, I'm just not going to get on a scale and I'm not going to look, because that's a cycle, right? It's like you do one thing wrong and then you feel a little bad, and then like you're afraid to look, and then we just don't get on the scale, and then we can really get, it's like, no, it's like we're always okay, because this is about the process and the journey. It's not about perfection. This was always going to happen, and that's okay. You just get back on the horse, right? And so, definitely like that, we're, slipping up on little things, that always can happen. And another big reason, certainly about this time in a weight loss journey, is that if someone has really committed, to exercise, and maybe they're lifting a lot, I mean, there are, they may be adding a lot of muscle mass, and that can kind of blur things on the scale. And that's why we have that nice backup of body composition scanning to really be able to look under the hood and tell on that. Okay. So plateaus can happen for a variety of reasons. They are always going to happen. And our response to this, should always be like calm, and we proceed, right? So going a little deeper on some of those things, that metabolic adaptation, that's always going to be a really big challenge. We do understand that this persists, some amount of that. And so we just have to accept at the beginning of the journey, like, this isn't entirely fair, and you are dealing with like a caveman, right? The reassuring part of this though is that, like, it's not you, right? Like this was always going to happen. We also try to really work with at this visit, this sort of seamless transition of what we do when we hit a plateau. Because for those of us who have tried a lot of times to lose weight, there can be like a lot of panic, like, oh no, right? And it feels like this thing is like just over, like here it comes again, right? Something else isn't going to work. And it's like, we want to really change that language. It's like, no, this was always going to happen. So what do? One, I stay calm. And I might repeat to myself like a mantra out loud, I am a human being. There was always going to, be a plateau. This is not me. It's the caveman in my brainstem, etc. After that, you want to start, as I call, like checking in, right? So if the scale isn't going the way we want it, you just pause and reflect. Okay. So has anything changed, right? Like, am I, have we gone out a lot? Have I slipped off on tracking? And you just want to like buckle down a little bit, right? And so have I gotten away from mindful and intuitive eating? Okay. So like we refresh on that, track for a couple days, use tracking as a tool that can come and go. All the evidence definitely supports consistent use, but realistically, we all get tired of it. And so when it needs to come back is when we're not progressing, right? So bring that back. That's going to allow you to examine, all of those variables of food, right? So are my calories roughly in line? I'm not eating too close to bedtime. My quality is good. I'm not snacking a lot, these little bites here and there, because tracking can really help you be accountable for that. And if you're doing all of that right, then we have to consider, okay, then maybe metabolic adaptation has set in. So maybe I do need to make an adjustment, either in intake or in like output. And so we actually talk about that. So sometimes we will go through, if someone's diet is like really great, sometimes we'll talk about shifting things, right? And so sometimes I look at like someone's kind of food log and it's like, I wouldn't change anything, but I can tell you how to sort of cheat things in a way. I mean, work with known physiologic issues. And so that is, let's say that I know that someone's really insulin resistant, and I might say, okay, actually I said this morning in clinic. I'm like, I don't want to, this person always has like a mid-morning kind of snack of a banana and an apple. And I'm like, I'm totally on board with you. I always want you to like listen and, if you're hungry, by all means, like eat. However, after we sleep all night, you've kind of burned through like all of your glycogen. You kind of wake up like ready to like get into a fat burning. And so if we could just prolong how long it is till we have a significant carb load, that would be great. So would you be open to, switching to just like strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, and so we talked about subbing out, right, some lower glycemic index fruits instead of the banana and apple that she had been doing. And that will sort of prolong what we call sort of like adapted fasting. It's like you're not really not eating, but you're sort of masking. This is sort of like why keto and Atkins work. If people never eat a carb, they will lose lots of weight. This is not really particularly sustainable, right? But yet it does work. But so we can borrow a little bit from that and choose to sort of eat lower kind of glycemic indexing. So we'll talk about that as a technique. We also talk about a lot like partial meal replacements. I will always say that in a plateau is one of the only times that I will ever advocate for temporary, weirdo dietary changes. So we might do partial meal replacements, and that would be like, protein shake, one reasonable meal, just to see if we can shake things up, get through the plateau, and then just go back to like whatever, we like. Because it really is all just about like getting, through that plateau, right? And so we'll talk about like various techniques for that. And obviously we always have open to us medication adjustment as well. Because if we're doing everything right and it's not me, right? That's the other thing that we can do. So variety of techniques can be considered, also medication adjustment. And then this is also the visit where we really want to hone in and like revisit exercise, right? Because I think, a lot of places that you go, and certainly this was my experience in the healthcare system early, was like, well, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And so, and if you haven't like worked out in a while, I mean, I've shared that like, hey, the first time that I tried to do Peloton ride, I mean, I got off like ugly sobbing, at 6 minutes. I couldn't do that. And here's the thing, right? For successful weight loss, what you really need is, I need you to have a good exercise routine at the end of this. Why? Because of metabolic adaptation, and you're so much smaller. And so when we look at, that smaller body mass and also your adaptation, it's like brass tacks, like nobody gets that many calories in the end, right? So this is when exercise becomes important, right? And so the really cool thing about that is if we just literally commit, I always say like practice the art of putting yourself first. And we start with maybe 5 minutes a day and then add 5 minutes like next month. Yeah, at the end of the year, that's actually 60 minutes. And for anyone that tells you and recommends for weight loss, the 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, like, so they're wrong. And that gets into, I really kind of gently sort of revisit like our definition of exercise and really what recommendations are, because we are very far off on our typical understanding of that. So number one, what we commonly hear in the media, the 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. Okay. So that is referring to primarily like cardio type exercise. It's also not the full recommendation. So it is 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week of, or we can just say 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise. So what is moderate? And that means I couldn't carry on a conversation while I'm doing it. But I could get a 3 to 5 word phrase out. Okay. And 2 to 3 days of strength training. So, that is the recommendation for maintenance, the normal care and keeping of a human body, right? When we look at data for loss, studies that look at exercise for loss are, generally going to recommend somewhere between 270 and 300 minutes of moderate exercise per week. So that's an hour a day, 5 days a week, plus your 2 to 3 days of strength. That is what the evidence shows. That is what the evidence shows. And so part of this readjustment is like, wow, a lot of times our understanding is, and so we kind of explain this, right? And the definition of exercise. Now, what's interesting is there are additional recommendations which say, actually, for maintenance, you could do 75 minutes a week of vigorous. And that means I'm panting so hard, like I couldn't talk at all. So there's variation in that. And a lot of it depends on intensity. So the more intense that activity is, then the lower sort of total of minutes like it can be. But wherever we're at, we want to build that. We also go over, and this is sort of getting at, in addition to those food interventions, right, that we talk to get through a plateau, we can also revisit exercise. And so a lot of times we'll go over, these recommendations. A lot of people will talk about walking, that they started walking. And so walking is what we call NEAT, right? Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And so that doesn't count as exercise, but it's still great. 60 to 70% of our daily calorie burned are non-exercise activity, right? And so that's where those little actions of using a standing desk, right? Doing just a few squats, like in a minute at work, all these things, making use of time you have, that's when that can be really helpful, because that is the overwhelming majority of your calorie burn. But we also want to develop cardiovascular health. And so we'll generally go over any limitations or challenges. Certainly if someone has any physical challenges, we might recommend like consultation with an exercise physiologist to really like help them out with that. And also go over the evidence for strength training, right? So, I remember at the Obesity Society conference a few years back, there was this cute little kind of debate between sports med and cardiology about what type of exercise is efficient. And so, this sort of, I'm going to hesitate in saying this. I will present the evidence. I will also point out, this is kind of like when to take a pill, right? The best time is when you can remember it. And so the answer to a lot of physical activity is maybe not what's good, better, best, perfect, but what you like and what you can be consistent with. And so I will always come back to that. I will tell you that, hour for hour, if you do an hour of cardio versus like an hour of weightlifting, probably going to burn more calories with the cardio, right? However, what we know, especially with morning workouts, is that typically people who do cardio will tend to eat more kind of through the day. Nobody knows why. I've never seen that explained. Strength training, right? Now that's going to be a little bit different. So they will burn less during that 1 hour period of exercise, right? However, then their body has to pay the caloric kind of the calorie money, I like to say, to repair the muscles that were torn down with weightlifting, and also the increased cost of maintaining that muscle mass, because muscle mass is the primary driver of metabolic rate, right? And so because that sort of costs more, they're ahead, right? Like at the end. So generally, some weight training is going to be probably a little bit more efficient for weight loss. There is also a timing component, and read them and weep. I didn't like this. I know it was published in October. I cannot remember if it was 22 or 23 in the journal Obesity, which went over, does the timing of workouts matter? And so, so it turns out the morning workout, that was the only time that was actually associated with a linear correlation with loss. So literally the more effort they put in, the more they worked out, the more intense. If they had a first thing in the morning workout, they had a linear association with like how much they lost. For every other group or time period, whether it was midday or later, it was kind of like an L-shaped kind of. And so after a certain amount, even if they worked out more, they just weren't getting any benefit at later in the day workouts. So again, this is all background data. Now, if you truly detest the mornings, am I telling you to go not do that? No. I'm giving you pressure points you might want to investigate to help get through a plateau, because these are all the things we know, right? And ultimately, our job is not to make you completely miserable by doing everything the evidence says. It's to be aware of all of this and to understand, hey, we might need to do this just for a little bit to get through a plateau. But you know what? If you're in maintenance, like, well, who cares what time of day? Like, you're not even trying to lose any more anyway, right? And so, take all of this. I always say, like, look, I can tell you what all the data says. How we're going to make that work in your life is going to be very individualized and different. And so, we definitely go over the evidence for exercise. We're going to favor a little bit strength, although not to the extent that I'm going to tell you, don't do what you like. That's crazy. If you find something you like, I want you to continue in that. And then also some components of timing, which can make your exercise more efficient, right? And then we just want to be careful because when we hit a plateau, I always want to know, even if it's before a visit, because this little thing is what becomes a stumbling block. Because, if we don't see that progression, we can all get discouraged and want to get up. And then why am I doing this, right? And so, it's always like this balance, right? And so, no one is ever broken, when they hit a plateau. You are absolutely a human being. We're always going to hit plateaus, whether those are, induced because of some stressful event. You start emotionally eating, like me, or whether it's just a physiologic plateau. I mean, they're just going to happen. And so I always say, the goal in a weight loss journey is don't get too attached to anything, because probably at some point we'll have to change it. And so, just flexibility is really, really productive. And I will tell you, kind of the more that it happens, and the more that you get through and then you sort of like conquer, it just success builds on success, right? And so happier we generally are. So if you got this far, great. You can certainly reflect on your concurrent routine. And then I always think like, there should never be one prescriptive sort of formula for everyone. It's always about reflection and thinking about like, what could I change? And sometimes that's all we're there for. And so definitely food, we always boil it down to those 4 variables, like amount, timing, frequency, and quality. And then, on the exercise side, like what we're doing, making sure that there's a strength component and sometimes changing the timing. And so that's generally pressure points I would start with if we're at a plateau. Okay. And we look forward to seeing you later.